Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Goodrum Show with me, Chris Goodrum. As per usual, a big thank you to everybody that watched last week's episode of the show, liked, commented, all that kind of stuff. It's very, very much appreciated. So, yeah, Storning, went down quite well. In actual fact, I shoehorned the floor malted rye into last week's American whiskey tasting evening. Yes, I know it's not American. That was the whole point. It was blind. If I hadn't put it in a sock, then everybody would have gone, "Hang on, that's not American." And it stood up pretty well to some heavyweight American whiskies. I mean, to me, there was an obvious difference, and eventually, I believe, sort of everybody kind of figured it out. So. Yeah, anyway, that was last week. This week, some new stuff. Yeah, always like to review some new stuff on the show. And as you can see from the title page, we're looking at some new releases from Brave New Spirits now. As you probably well remember, they arrived with quite an explosion about a year or so back. And obviously vast amounts of money was spent on cask acquirement because they released an absolute wodge of casks. And they're back doing it again this year. So as you can see, I have 3 samples from each of the 2 ranges. The whiskies of Voodoo. I mean, there were some really cool labels, it has to be said. You know, and I know that as I go on about it, it's not about the packaging and the labelling, it's the juice in the bottle, but yeah, the labels and the names are just really good. And to a certain extent, the Cask Noir range as well, really quite innovative and interesting. So I've obviously got 3 from each of those 2 ranges, which we'll be looking at today. Don't really need to tell you very much about the company because I've already had done 2, maybe 3. I can't remember how many episodes I've done on them now. So I'll just basically introduce today's lineup because they're all cask strength, so they're all going to need a drop of water from one's butt. Yes, puerility again. Anyway, so let's just take a look at today's lineup.
Listen to the silence with bait and breath.
Right, okay, so we're going to start off with a couple of grains, probably the best way to do it, I think. So the first one is in the Whiskies of Voodoo range. This is called Blood Moon, and they've labelled it as a Lowland single grain. It's 13 years old, bottled at 49.8%, and it is a vatting of North British, which has been aged in first fill sherry and first fill bourbon wine casks. Nice colour. No, will there be much in the way of grain character after all of that oak? Well, we shall find out. Grain number 2 is in the Cask Noir range. This is a Cameronbridge 12-year-old. They've called it Take It to the Brig. Yeah, good name. It's bottled at 57%, and it's a first fill Pedro Ximenez hogshead, distilled in May of 2010, bottled in August of last year. Then we're going to move on to the Sherry Monster. Oh, damn, did I say that? This is a Cask Noir 22-year-old Benrinnes. It's called the Sentinels Legacy. It's bottled at 52.6%. Now, it's allegedly first fill Oloroso, Oloroso quarter cask. Now, I don't know whether it's spent its entire 22 years in it. Look at the colour of that. It may well have spent 22 years in an Oloroso quarter cask. Oof. Apparently only yielded 120 bottles, which is actually pretty bloody amazing, because if it spent 22 years in a quarter cask, the evaporation, so maybe it was finished in Oloroso quarter cask, maybe it was aged in an Oloroso barrel, butt, whatever, and then finished in quarter cask. That I should have asked Paul, but I honestly didn't. Talking of which, big thank you to Paul from Brave New Spirits for all the samples for today's episode of the show. Then we're going to move on to some Campbeltown. Yes, now, so this is blended Campbeltown. It's the Cask Noir blended Campbeltown 6-year-old. They've called it Mysteries of the Wee Toon. Always made me wonder why they called the place the wee Toon. I mean, that's not exactly very Scottish, is it? I mean, it's more bloody Newcastle, isn't it? So I think they call themselves the Toon, don't they, or something like that. Anyway, who knows about these things? Maybe somebody will be able to tell me why you call it the wee Toon. I assume it's probably Scottish for small town, I would imagine. Just came to my head, you know, only just kind of occurred to me that may well be it. Oh, all right, yes, thank God I'm better at tasting whiskey. Anyway, so this is bottled at 59.2%. It's first fill bourbon barrel, distilled in March of 2016, bottled in August of 22. I have been told it is not the current Campbeltown lock. This wasn't purchased from the distillery. This was a private purchase, and so it could be Glen Scotia, teaspoon Springbank, could be anything at the end of the day. But it's a blended Campbeltown. When hopefully when we taste it, we'll discover what it is. Penultimate bottling is back to the whiskies of Voodoo. This is called the High Priest. This is a single island malt. It's 8 years old, bottled at 52.6%, and it is a Whitlow. Now, I always thought Whitlow was the term that Highland Park gave to its teaspoon malt, but apparently, as it's labelled as a single malt, it can't be. So therefore, it must be just a name they have a tendency to use. And it reminds me of a little story that I was told by an independent bottling company who purchased casks of Ardmore, the peated Glen Turret, and somebody had actually spelt on the paperwork Ardmore incorrectly. So he couldn't actually call it Ardmore because it had been sold as Ardmore, and he couldn't call it that because that made absolutely no sense at all. So I imagine he probably ended up calling it peated Glen Turret or something of that ilk. I honestly don't know because we don't talk anymore. But anyway, so this is maybe a part of the industry that you didn't actually realise, but you know, even if it came from Highland Park, if the bill of sale states that it's a Whitlow, you cannot call it Highland Park because it is not. It has been sold as a cask or casks of Whitlow. Same with any of the other sort of distilleries. But there you go. That's one of the sort of weird oddities of the whisky industry. Anyway, so it's, like I say, Whitlow, Highland Park, aged in first fill wine barriques. And the final bottling of the evening. No, it's it's not evening. It's afternoon. Yes, it is actually afternoon today. So this is the Whiskey of Voodoo's Iron Collar. This is a Highland single malt, aged 12 years old, 57%, and it is Ardmore, aged in ex-Islay barrels. They obviously got a pretty damn big lot of this stuff because obviously, if you remember back, what the hell was it? Where the Eagles Dare, I think, bottling from last year's releases in the Cask Noir range was exactly the same thing. Ardmore, aged in ex-Islay barrels, and I've seen it in other independents as well. So somebody must have got hold of a load of Ardmore. Probably the distillery, I imagine, decided to do it. I don't honestly know, but there seems to be an inordinate amount of this kind of double peat Ardmore kind of knocking around. But anyway, and it's all been pretty damn good. So you know, it's not knocking the juice at all. But anyway, we'll obviously get to that in due course. So that is today's lineup. Let's kick off fairly sharpishly with a bit of Voodoo Grain. Right, okay, so let's kick off with the Blood Moon. So 13-year-old North British. Let's see what the nose gives on this. Okay, yep, that's an okay nose. It's pleasant. It's got sort of plenty of slightly high-toned, grainy, dried fruits. Some oxidised, almost kind of, sort of red winey fruits. A little bit of herbal sherry. Yeah, I mean it's okay. I mean on its own, you know, you'd look at a 12-year-old grain and go, "Ooh, that's not going to have an awful lot of character, is it?" There is a suggestion of possible sulphur note in the background. I mean, I'm kind of blessed or possibly cursed with sort of being very susceptible to sulphur, and so I pick it up really quite easily. And you know, I would imagine the vast majority of people probably wouldn't have noticed it. There's a little bit of vanilla now, some coconut. Yeah, and that sulphur note is lessening a bit, so it's okay. It's not a bad nose at all. Let's see what the power's like. That sulphur note is just there. Again, maybe a rogue butt possibly, or something like that. It kicks off with more of the sherry character and getting sort of treacle, walnut, prune, dark fruit. Not so much of the wine cask. The grainy dried fruit kind of comes through on the middle. It's got the alcohol is emphasising the nip of the grain, which is quite pleasant. It's nicely balanced. It's not hugely complex, it has to be said. We're going to put a little drop of water with it and see what that does to it. Yeah, that sulphur note does seem to be a lot lessened now. I mean, it wasn't particularly a huge note at the beginning, to be bluntly honest with you. It's brought out more of the wine cask now, got more sweeter red fruits, that kind of thing. A little bit of dried fruit, a touch of toast. Yeah, I mean, it's not a bad nose at all. Let's see what it smells like now. Again, brought out the sweeter red fruits to start off with. That slight sulphur note is still there. A little bit drying, a little bit short, but there's a nice syrup coating to the finish. There's a little bit of spice. Overall, it's not too bad. It's certainly not one I'm getting sort of majorly excited about, but it's not a bad whiskey at the end of the day. Okay, so let's move on to the 12-year-old Cameronbridge. So let's take it to the Brig then, shall we? See what the nose gives us on this. That's actually a nice nose. Blackberries, earthy, dusty spice, lovely graininess, really intense, grainy, nippy, dried fruits, tar, earth, dark PX fruit. That's really well balanced, actually, and this is the one thing I find with grain whiskies. They really do work well with sherry. They just seem to have that intensity of graininess, which just kind of works with the sherry. There's a little spiritiness, touch of black coffee, maybe a bit of peanut as well. Yeah, I like that. I think that's for a sherry whiskey. Let's see what that's on. That is pretty masked. That alcohol is pretty intense. Again, quite nicely balanced. Again, we've got the sort of like the dried fruit, dark black fruits, nippy grain, a little bit of spice, a little bit of vanilla, touch of black coffee, some tannin. Not much of a finish because the alcohol is completely sort of masking that. But it does give those spices a sort of a nice kind of boost, which I think is quite pleasant. Little bit of again, the syrup is kind of there on the aftertaste. Let's see what a little drop of water does now. Right, that's emphasising the crispness of the grain. The sherry notes are now sort of slightly more subdued. A little bit more aromatic, possibly, maybe a little bit more sweeter as well. I like the balance. I think the balance is really, really good. maybe it's because you don't expect a huge amount of complexity from, say, a 12-year-old grain. What you want from the grain is obviously a nippiness, a kind of like a spiciness, a freshness to kind of offset any sweetness from cask, and this just works really well. See what pass on. More grain on the palate as well. Fruit not quite so black, it's a little bit softer, a bit simpler, but again it's got a lovely nip, that lovely spiciness, quite juicy, almost kind of minerally feel to the finish, not quite so sweet, not quite so syrupy, although that syrup note is there. And it's got a, like I said, it's got this almost kind of mineraliness, not quite mineral, but almost mineral note on the finish. That's lovely. I really like that. That's a sort of, I mean, it's not something I would want to drink all of the time. I mean, it still is predominantly about the sherry, but there is some balancing factor there, which, yeah, I would quite happily have the odd glass of that, maybe. Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to some more sherry then. So this is the 22-year-old Sentinels Legacy. Let's see what the nose gives us on this then, shall we? Sherry Monster. But a mature sherry monster. So we're in that kind of Armagnac-y, oxidised fruit, dried fruit, raisins, treacle, a little bit of dusty spice. I mean, absolutely zero distillery character whatsoever, which, considering Benrinnes can be a bit hard and a bit unyieldy, I'm not kind of getting too bent out of shape about that, it has to be said. Brown sugar, violet, edgy spice. It's that kind of, I'm getting, if you sniff hard enough, maybe you get a little bit of edgy barley in amongst all that sort of sherry character, a bit of spice, citrus. Now, I mean, this is three figures. I think this is about, you know, about 180 something quid a bottle, which it's a 22-year-old cask strength whiskey. What, you know, there's not a surprise there. And if you love your mature sherry cask whiskies, then you're going to absolutely kill for this. It's spot on. No blemishes, no sulphur, no dirtiness. Really pristinely clean, lovely maturity. It probably has spent 22 years in a quarter cask, which and it actually doesn't smell too tannic, which again I'm quite surprised about. I assume that the quarter cask must have been kind of constructed from, you know, a well used hoggy or butt, possibly sherry butt. Because it certainly doesn't seem to, I don't get the vanillins, so I don't think it was kind of like, you know, an American oak cask cut down into a quarter and then seasoned with sherry. I think this was probably made from a sherry butt, and quite a well used sherry butt. But anyway, let's see what pass like. Soft, sherried, malty, mature, dried fruit, a little astringency there on the finish, a little mature sort of sawdusty oak kind of coming through on the mid palate, raisins, walnuts, juicy dried fruit, lovely finish, doesn't need any water at all. I mean, that is just really in a nice place, it has to be said. Again, if you love your sherry matured whiskies. No distillery character, no Benrinnes character. Like I said, maybe that's not the end of the world. So what we have here is we have cask and we have oxidation character. And it's got a lovely complexity, it has to be said. It's just really very, very good. Again, if you like this kind of style of whiskey, you're going to wet yourself over it, it has to be said. It's pleasant for me, yeah, nice, good, I can sell it. It's not something I'm going to sort of rave endlessly about, but it's, you know what I like with sherry matured whiskies, but I would quite happily put that on the shelf. And well, you know, if I was talking in my kind of company kind of persona, then I would say yes, I've definitely put this on the shelf, and I would more than happily sell this to you, sir, as they say. But obviously, because this has got nothing to do with my employer whatsoever. But anyway, you read between the lines. Well, that was read between the lines. I think I just spelt it out there, didn't I? Honestly, God, I say some crap at times, don't I?
I'm waiting for the dawn.
Right, okay, so let's move on to a bit of wee Toon then, as they say. A fresh bourbon barrel, 6-year-old blend, Campbeltown blend. Really salty, earthy, barleyed, little bit of peat, little thread of peat, vanilla, fishiness, Springbank, just says Springbank to me. There's a nice maltiness though to it, a little bit more maltiness than I would normally expect from Springbank. So I'm kind of going here with maybe a little bit more than a teaspoon Springbank. I think there's a little bit more Glen Scotia character than just would be apparent from a literal teaspoon. It's malt, apricot, apple, marzipan, lovely, almost ozone-y kind of freshness. Now, it is a bit pricey for a 6-year-old, it has to be said. I'm not going to tell you what it would hit the shelves for, but it is, if you looked at it purely as a, my God, I'm spending how much on a 6-year-old, you kind of almost to a certain extent have to forget that because of what it is. And what it is nice. I mean, first fill, I'm not getting a huge amount of oak. There's a little bit of a creaminess with time. Give it some time to settle in the glass and you do get some creamy oak. But this is pretty much all about the spirit, and the spirit is good. Anyway, let's see what the palate's like. There's no finish on that, that is well and truly masked, but fishy, earthy, barleyed, coastal, intense. Again, predominantly it's certainly very much in the Springbank kind of character. Wood spice on the aftertaste, which is being emphasised by the alcohol. Subtle peat note just kind of creeping in there. That really does need some water. That is, it's almost painful on the tongue, but then, you know, we are almost, what, 60%. So that's not exactly sort of like a huge surprise. Let's see what a little drop of water does. Right, that's definitely emphasised the oiliness and the fishiness and that classic Springbank character. Really clean, really fresh, none of that sort of dirty Campbeltown funk. I know that will probably put a fair few of you off, but to me, lovely. A little bit more malty underneath as well. Again, I'm kind of going with a kind of predominant Springbank with, you know, what, sort of 30, 40, 20 or 30% Glen Scotia, I would have said. Not quite so salty with a little drop of water, but there is still some brine, some oxidised fruit, and a lovely freshness. Yeah, that's a lovely nose. Let's see what the palate's like now. Good length. I mean, for 6 years old, I mean, that is lovely. That is remarkably drinkable. It's lighter in body, but it's maltier. Maybe it's kind of bringing out a little bit more of the Glen Scotia. But there's still that lovely fishiness. There's a little bit of dark oxidised fruit on the mid palate. It's a bit fleeting, but it's definitely there. some spice. Again, that's that kind of gentle peat waft. It's not a major amount of peat, but there's just a little bit there. It's just really adding to the overall complexity of it. And like I say, for a 6-year-old, it has loads and loads and loads of character. The oak isn't really giving an awful lot to it, bar the kind of structure. There's a bit of a tannic feel to it, but I'm not getting the sort of like the creamy vanillins that I would expect, or the sort of bourbon-y notes I would expect from a first fill bourbon barrel. So it's very, very much spirit centric, and with a supporting oak character. It's just absolutely gorgeous, I think. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Whitlaw, or the High Priest, as they say. So this is an 8-year-old aged in first fill wine barrique. Let's see what the nose gives us then, shall we? It's a bit reserved. It's quite earthy, tobacco-y. There's some supple red wine fruitiness, tar. There's got quite an astringent peat character, a sort of green, limey, sort of gooseberry-ish kind of astringent, coastal, herbal, peaty kind of note there. Actually quite peaty for Highland Park. Possibly that's why they call it Whitlaw. It certainly has more peat character than you would normally expect. There's a sort of damp straw, earth, manure, islandy, coastal kind of notes. That's got a hell of a lot of character for 8 years old. I mean, and this is it. I mean, you kind of look at these things and you just, to a certain extent, you have to ignore the fact that they are relatively young whiskies at 6, 8, you know. They have their kind of, you know, age is just a number at the end of the day, and which I keep telling people. A whiskey can have, you know, so much interest like this one does at 8 years old, and it's just a sort of a lovely kind of balance of the spirit, the cask, and that's what it's about at the end of the day. You know, I think we're kind of well beyond the sort of like, you know, the sort of age fetish kind of thing. We have so many young whiskies and so many no age statement whiskies on the market these days. So yeah, that's what it's all about. You know, it's all about what is the spirit sort of saying to me. And this is good spirit. This is a good Highland Park. You know, I mean, if only the 12-year-old Highland Park, you know, the sort of standard distillery bottling was of this quality, you know, I'd be enraptured about it. But as we well know, that ain't the case. Anyway, let's see what the pals are. Yeah, we kick off with a wine cask. Lots of winey red fruits, berry fruits, and then in comes a bit of peat, quite astringent coastal notes, malt, roasted meat, bit of roasted meat, chewy, quite malty as well. Ooh, that's a nice kind of sweet peat note right on the finish, almost violety. I like that. That's really impressive. I must admit, I do like kind of wine casks and peat. They do kind of go together quite well, as long as they don't end up in this kind of butyric kind of mess, which this one certainly doesn't. I think it kind of works really well. But the Highland Park character just really comes through. I'm quite surprised at that, at how much Highland Park character there is. That sort of heathery, sort of coastal character coming through, with a good dollop of peat in actual fact. So, you know, although you may well think it's a bit kind of like off the wall, a bit funky, it's got some really lovely character. It's really well balanced. Let's put a little drop of water with it and see what that does to it. Okay, so that's emphasising the kind of the sweet berry juicy fruits. There's again, that sort of astringency is definitely still there, sort of herbal astringency. It's kind of almost reminding me of kind of Sauvignon Blanc, nettly, that kind of herbal intensity. That's a nice nose. It's a little bit more heavier on the wine cask. I think personally I would have, I prefer the nose without a drop of water. But either way, that's still pretty good. Let's see what it passes like now. A bit like the nose, it's kind of made the palate a little simpler, more emphasis on the wine cask, less about the spirit. There's a nice sweetness to the palate, and that sweetness is kind of encompassing the peat a little bit. Sort of juicy, sort of slightly syrupy, sort of red winey kind of notes, and peat, and a touch of herbalness, not quite so much of that Sauvignon character that was found on the nose. Personally, I prefer that neat. I think it has more interest, more intensity, more complexity. It's a kind of an either-or whiskey, isn't it? You kind of either go with the intensity, complexity, and maybe the sort of like the sort of shorter finish, or you go with the longer finish, the dilution, the less complexity. It's one of those kind of either-or whiskies. But you know, I think for me, neat, lovely. Right, okay, so let's move on to the iron collar. So Ardmore aged the next Isla cask. Let's see what the nose is on this end, shall we? It's a bit reserved. There's a nice kind of earthiness, earthy, peaty character, subtle violets. It's actually quite delicate. I mean, I find Ardmore can sometimes be quite kind of in your face and sort of unsubtle, but this has a subtlety to it, and there's more sweeter barley notes as well. There is obvious peat, there's obviously earthy peat and slightly coastal peat, a bit of brine, some green fruit. That's actually really quite complex. Again, you know, 12 years old. It's in a nice place, shall we say. It's an interesting nose. It's not quite as peat orientated as some of the Ardmores that have been aged in ex-Isla cask. Maybe the time and maturity is starting to sort of mellow some of that peat kind of character out. But it's still got a good dollop of peat. I mean, it ain't short of that, it has to be said. But it has a delicacy, which is certainly a word I would never generally use with Ardmore, it has to be said. I should pass on. A good chunk of earthy peat, but again you've got that sweet barley character which is kind of balancing, and it's kind of a weird thing when you think about it, you know, sort of astringent, sort of earthy peat and sweetness, but they actually work really, really well, and the sweetness of the barley kind of underpins everything. It's a bit mass, it's a bit sure. That alcohol is quite intense and quite, I mean, what is it, 57%? It is giving the impression of spice, although there is really no spice there. It's the sort of alcohol kind of tingling on the tongue. It's a bit of straw, bit of earth. It's a good whiskey. It's a lovely whiskey in actual fact. It's not as peaty as I was expecting. Again, I mean, like I said, with the nose, I've had Ardmores that have been aged in ex-Isla casks that have just basically been big peat, but this has some subtlety to it, which is actually quite impressive. Let's put a little drop of water with it. More Highlandy kind of character now. It's more of that kind of green fruit, green pepper, less of the peat in actual fact. There's a slight sort of, maybe an emphasis on the coastalness possibly, a little bit minerally, fresh, crisp, really, really nice. I mean, it's a lovely nose, it has to be said. It doesn't, like I said, it definitely says mainland rather than sort of Isla. even though the casks are from Ireland. But yeah, let's see what the parts are. Fuller, rounder, more sweet barley, more cask, more vanilla, less peat, although the peat kind of does come through again with that kind of tinge of green fruit and that astringency right on the finish. A little bit of tannin, some chewy maltiness right on the aftertaste. Lovely length, really very, very good, really impressive. Lovely mouth filling character. Yeah, that is very, very impressive. Again, not the most peatiest of Ardmore, but there is enough peat there to kind of like, you know, get the peat juices flowing, as they say. And it's got a nice astringency as well, but that's kind of balanced. Certainly with the water, it kind of emphasises the sweet barley and just gives it a lovely kind of balance between the sweetness and the astringency. Overall, I love that. I think that is just absolutely gorgeous. That is the sort of whiskey that I could quite happily drink all night. Well, maybe not all night, but you know, I could certainly have a couple of drams of that quite happily, and I'd be more than that would fill my peat needs quite happily. So yeah, quite happy with that one. So let's sum today's episode of the show up. Again, a big thank you to Paul from Brave New Spirits for the samples for today's episode of the show. It's kind of always a bit of a thing, I suppose, when you start playing around with lots of different wine casks and that kind of thing, to kind of keep the balance. And yeah, overall, I'm really, really impressed with what Brave New Spirits are doing. The Blood Moon, I mean, okay, yep. Ordinarily, if there wasn't that slight sulphur blemish there, I would be sort of more than happy to put that on the shelf. I mean, it's a nice whiskey for a young grain. Although I have to say, the 12-year-old Cameronbridge is just head and shoulders above it. I mean, yes, okay, it's quite heavily sherried, a lot of PX kind of character, but the grain balances that. And that's what I'm looking for. The Sentinels Legacy, the 22-year-old Benrinnes, yeah, it is what it is at the end of the day. It's a mature sherry monster. There will be people that like that, and the quality is, I think worth the price tag. I love the wee Toon. I love Springbank, as you well know. It's a lovely blend. I mean, you know, you've got to go an awful long way to screw up a bloody Springbank or a Campbeltown whiskey at the end of the day. It's pretty much kind of cast iron stuff at the end. But, you know, there have been crap bottlings of it in the past, no doubt. That is not one of them. It's a bit on the pricey side for a 6-year-old, but ignore the fact that it's a 6-year-old. Concentrate on the quality of the spirit in the bottle, and I honestly think it's worth it. The High Priest, the Whitlow, yeah, lovely. Like I said, you know, if Highland Park 12-year-old was of that quality, I would, you know, be more than happy to stock it. I used to in the past when Highland Park 12-year-old was of that quality, but of course, as we well know, it ain't that anymore. So yeah, really very, very good. And the Ardmore, I loved the Ardmore. I thought it was a great spirit, great whiskey. Not as hugely peated as some of the Ardmores finished in Exile casks, like I said, but there's a good chunk of peat there, and it's got that kind of nice earthy peat versus kind of slight coastal astringent peat going on. And, you know, it's just overall just a really lovely whiskey. So overall, I have to say that, yeah, there have been some bottlings that I've kind of not included in today's episode of the show because I didn't think they kind of reached the level that these ones have gone to. And that's no criticism to Brave New Spirits. It's the same with every independent bottling company that I've ever tasted from. You know, that you will have good stuff, you will have not quite so good stuff. It's just the way these things are, and it's kind of pretty much down to me to kind of, you know, wheedle out the crap, I suppose. You know, I don't want to sort of, you know, be too kind of intrusive, but you know, it is basically, you know, you send me the samples, I kind of like sort of taste them, I decide which ones I think are really worthwhile to put on the shelf, and it's like I said, it's kind of, you know, I don't have to sell everything, I don't have to put everything on the shelf. And you know, it's so you know that when you kind of like buy a bottle of whiskey from me, you know that the quality is going to be really good, and I'm more than happy with sort of selling, you know, the bulk of these. So anyway, that's this week's episode of the show in the bag. I'm certainly feeling the effects of 6 cask strength whiskey, so forgive me if I'm kind of rambling, but all that's left to say is good afternoon and good dramming.